before the cities, before the flags, before the name America was ever spoken. There were footsteps on this land, ancient footsteps. But who did they belong to? When we picture the first Americans, different images come to mind. Some imagine copper-toned hunters crossing vast plains. Others speak of darker-skinned tribes whose stories were lost to time. So who were the very first people of this continent? To answer that, we have to travel back further than memory. More than 15,000 years ago, during the last ice age, much of the northern world was frozen. Sea levels were lower. And between what is now Siberia and Alaska, a massive stretch of land existed, a region known as Beringia. Across that land, small bands of humans moved slowly, generation after generation. They followed, the great herds of bison across the frozen plains. Every step was a fight against the cold, against the wind, against the land itself. They were hunters, survivors, explorers. They didn't know they were entering a new world. They were simply following food, climate, and opportunity. Over thousands of years, their descendants spread southward, through forests, deserts, mountains, and river valleys, eventually populating all of North and South America. Modern archaeology and DNA evidence trace indigenous American ancestry back to these ancient populations from Northeast Asia. But the journey of humanity doesn't begin there, because long before Asia, long before Beringia, all human beings trace their deepest roots back to Africa. The story of America is part of the larger human story. By the time European ships appeared on the horizon, the Americas were already alive with civilizations. In the north, powerful confederacies governed vast territories. In the south, empires engineered cities in the mountains and jungles. Across the land were hundreds of nations, each distinct, each rooted in place. Their skin tones were not one single shade. Like all human populations, appearance reflected climate, geography, and generations of adaptation. Over time, European writers began describing indigenous people using color labels, including red. But this was an outsider's description, not a biological identity. The first Americans were not defined by a color. They were defined by culture, land, and ancestry. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, African mariners were already sailing west, trading, exploring, and pushing the boundaries of the known world. Along the western shores of the powerful Mali Empire, sailors understood the rhythm of the Atlantic and the currents that carried ships far from land. But one story stands out. It was later told by the famous ruler Mansa Musa. Before his reign, the throne of Mali belonged to a king named Abu Bakr II. Curious about what lay beyond the endless Atlantic horizon, Abu Bakr sent a fleet of ships westward.
Pull together to the open sea! Safely!
Only one returned. Its sailors described a powerful ocean current pulling the fleet deep into the open sea. Most rulers would have stopped there, but Abu Bakr did the opposite. He ordered a second expedition, larger than the first, and this time, the emperor himself joined the voyage. The fleet sailed west into the Atlantic, and was never seen again. When Abu Bakr II did not return, the throne eventually passed to Mansa Musa, who would later share the story during his famous pilgrimage. What became of that fleet remains one of history's great mysteries. Whether Abu Bakr II's fleet ever reached distant shores remains unknown, but the question still remains long before European colonization. Who were the people already living in the Americas? Centuries later, another chapter was added to this land's history. During the transatlantic slave trade, Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas. Some escaped bondage and found refuge among native nations. In several regions, especially in the southeast, African and indigenous communities lived side by side. married, they built families. They fought wars together. From this shared history came communities sometimes known as Black Indians, people of blended African and Native ancestry, whose identity reflects both legacies. So who were the first known inhabitants of America? They are the ancestors of today's indigenous peoples. The native nations whose lineage stretches back more than 15,000 years on this land. Their distant ancestors came from Asia during the Ice Age. The first Americans were not defined by modern racial categories. They were the first nations of this land, communities that thrived, adapted, and shaped the continent long before European arrival. History is not a battle of colors. It is a story of movement, survival, and belonging, long before ships crossed the Atlantic, long before maps drew borders. This land already had people, and their descendants are still here.